Now, I see the current false claims about state laws suppressing votes in the same light. Whether Democrats believe that their own talking points, or whether it is a cynical attempt to paint Republicans as anti-voting, these false claims undermine faith in the democracy. I yield.
The senator from Ohio.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd like to go back a little further in history than last year's warmed over conspiracy theories that we just heard my friend from Iowa talk about. I so appreciated Senator Bennett's discussion of sort of the history of voting rights and the history of this body. The American public certainly doesn't know what cloture means. The American public really doesn't know all that much about the filibuster either. But go back a few decades. The filibuster was used to suppress the vote. The filibuster was used by many people in my political party back when too many Democrats were on the wrong side of history and the wrong side of civil rights. It was used by Southern segregationists. It was finally overcome by some Northern Republicans with a whole bunch of Northern Democrats. But then think what else the filibuster's been used for. The filibuster was used in the 1970s and 1980s to protect big tobacco in Kentucky. Or the filibuster was used to protect big oil. Now it's used to protect Wall Street. The filibuster is used to protect big tech companies. The filibuster is used in case after case after case to protect big drug companies. So we know that the whole purpose of the filibuster has been to protect the most affluent, the most privileged, the wealthiest corporate interests in this society that just get their way in this body day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. Now, this weekend, and many referred to this, we honored Dr. Martin Luther King. We heard a lot of words extolling his legacy. Those words from many who are for not supporting voting rights today, those words sounded pretty empty. Few people told the story of Dr. King in Memphis, why Dr. King was in Memphis. In early February of 1968, sanitation workers in Memphis, some of the most abused, taken advantage of workers in our country, mostly black workers doing a dirty, difficult job in a segregated city with a very racist mayor who let that be known in the ensuing months. These sanitation workers were not even given rest periods, particularly when they were in white neighborhoods. There was nowhere to go when they were picking up the garbage in white neighborhoods, in segregated white neighborhoods. There were no place to go for the rest periods. Two workers in early February in a rainstorm got in their garbage trucks to protect themselves from the rain for a few minutes. The garbage truck malfunctioned, those two workers, underpaid with no real benefits and no insurance and no help for their families. Those two workers were killed. Dr. King went to Memphis the first time to help lead that strike, to join the striking workers. The second time he went back, and that's when he was assassinated. Dr. King understood the dignity of work was intertwined with voting rights. Worker rights and voting rights always went together. Dr. King insisted no job is menial if it pays a decent wage. And those sanitation workers, as I said, low wages, no benefits, no health insurance, no retirement, none of that, few days off. Dr. King said, what does it profit a man to be able to eat at an integrated lunch counter if he doesn't earn enough money to buy a hamburger and a cup of coffee? He talked about the dignity of work, the term mostly popularized by him, and he said, as no work is menial if it pays an adequate wage. Until all workers have dignity in their job, Dr. King's work will remain unfinished. We can't get there if workers cannot vote. I don't mean just workers who put on a tie and sit at a desk. The vote should be open to everyone. I mean all workers. Whether you punch a clock, whether you swipe a badge, whether you work for tips, whether you're on salary, whether you're raising children, whether you're taking care of aging parents. We know who powers our economy. It's workers. It's not the rich donors and the corporate contributors that fund the politicians who are pushing for gerrymandering and voter suppression in the takeovers of local election boards. It's workers. I think about what we did in the Senate last week. With some difficulty, but ultimately it worked, we unanimously passed a resolution honoring the custodians and the maintenance workers. We had talked often about the police officers, some of whom gave their lives, dozens who were injured, all who were courageous. We honored them as we should. We also last week, though, passed a resolution honoring custodial workers and maintenance workers. They get little recognition. They work for too low pay. Last January, 1 year ago, these workers, largely black and brown workers, many of them immigrants, were forced to clean feces off the wall, clean up after the destruction of the white supremacists, and restore dignity to our capital after domestic terrorists ransacked it. The insurrectionists destroyed, the black and brown workers cleaned up, the carpenters and the maintenance workers and the painters, union members all rebuilt. Last week, we came together to honor their service. They deserve more than words, more than gratitude. So often, they and other working people don't have much of a voice in this country. They don't have the high-priced lobbies to come here. Many of you have looked down the hall and seen in front of Senator McConnell's office, you've seen the lobbyists lined up who always seem to get what they come for. Workers don't have corporate lobbyists. They aren't going on campaign donor retreats. But workers have the vote, or should have the vote. The voting booth is where all of us are supposed to have an equal voice. The voting booth is where workers are supposed to be able to go to hold the wealthy and the powerful accountable. So it's not surprising that politicians who pass corporate tax cuts, the same politicians who do the handouts to the wealthiest 1%, don't want lots of workers to vote. We know who voter suppression and election subversion is aimed at. It's at the parents working 2 jobs to pay the rent and make sure their kids have a decent meal with no control over their work lives and their work hours if they don't have a collective bargaining agreement. It's students, it's people who don't get a day off, it's seniors in nursing homes, it's home health care workers who care for them. So often these are women of color working the graveyard shift after coming straight from their second job. We know whose votes these politicians want to throw out after they're cast. We know which cities the former president went after. What does Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Senator Casey, and Atlanta, Georgia, Senator Ossoff and Warnock, what do they have in common? They're diverse places with a whole lot of black and brown workers who cast ballots that the rich and powerful don't like. Ultimately, as others have said, it comes down to this. These politicians want to cherry pick their voters rather than the voters picking their elected officials. Through gerrymandering, through voter suppression, through meddling in local election board, politicians want to pick and choose whose votes are counted. My state, President Trump carried my state twice by 8 points. My state, though, is about a 53, 54, 46, 47, slightly Republican state now. For the last decade, the members of Congress in my state, 12 Republicans, 4 Democrats. In 2012, and 14, and 16, and 18, and 20. None of that changed. Not one of those districts changed because Republicans, with their corruption and with their skill at drawing maps, drew those maps in ways that there was no real fair elections. We know whose votes they don't want to count. It's the votes of low-paid and the overlooked, the votes of workers who power this country, yet don't have much power. The votes of people who might hold politicians accountable, who might demand fewer tax cuts for rich people and an increase in the child tax credit, in the earned income tax credit, the largest tax cut for families in our nation's history. 90% of families in Colorado, in Georgia, in New Jersey, in Ohio, and all over this country, 90% of families with children get at least a $3,000 tax cut because of what we did in this body when we said no more Republican freight trains carrying tax cuts down the track. We were going to give tax cuts to moderate income people and working families. These votes of people who hold politicians accountable, the votes of people who understand the dignity of work. If you say you support American workers, you support their right to vote. I ask my colleagues of both parties come together to protect the right of every American to have a voice in this country, no matter who you are, no matter where you work, no matter where you live. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from North Carolina.
Thank you, Madam President. I did not intend to speak today. I came down here and listened to the speeches of some of my colleagues for 2 hours this morning and asked for an opportunity to get on the list of what are nearly 50 senators who are going to speak today. But I heard loud and clear some of the comments. I just wanted to go back and revisit them and talk about maybe the path forward after this vote occurs today, and I hope fails to change the filibuster rule. I think Senator Tester was the one who said he knew of a voter who waited 8 to 10 hours to vote. That's unacceptable. We need to change that. I would also say that probably over that 8 to 10 hours, they run a long line far beyond any restrictions they have for electioneering, so they could have food and water. Some people could have heard that speech and thought that someone was starving or thirsting to death for 8 or 10 hours, but we all know that most states have laws that allow anyone to provide food or water to others 50 feet away from the election sites. And I know if you've ever been in elections, you've been there too. I've been there handing out my push card 50 feet out, handing people water. That happens every day. The American people need to know that. And if there are states that have restrictions, that's something I hope I have a moment to talk about as we move forward. We also heard Senator Klobuchar say that 160 times the rules have changed. The fact of the matter is, they have never changed for the legislative calendar, which is what we're talking about, without regular order. It happened 7 times. And it happened because the majority of members, Democrats and Republicans, thought that we should modernize the rules. But we did it through regular order. It's never been done before. In fact, the 2 notable examples where the nuclear option was used was once by then Majority Leader Harry Reid and followed up by then Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. If that's not the best indicator of what will happen to this body, nothing is. Remember when Senator Reid said, we're just going to carve out a little bit of the executive calendar to make it easier for district judges to get elected. That's all we're going to do. Why on earth does anybody believe that that carve out wasn't going to result in the ultimate nuclear option for the executive calendar? That's why you have Justice Gorsuch, Justice Kavanaugh, and Justice Barrett. That's why you have it. This is political physics here. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And if you vote to nuke the legislative filibuster, you might as well build a wall straight down this body. Because anytime Democrats or Republicans hit the trifecta, and we have the White House, and we have the Senate, and we have the House, the minority's voice will count for nothing. And even worse, the voices of the vocal minority at either end of the political spectrum will have a disproportionate impact on what we vote on and pass out of this body. If you think it's hard getting the voting rights bills passed today, just think how hard it's going to be for you to stand down your most extreme base, we've got our own, on things that are not good for this country that the vast majority of the American people will not support. We will go to an every 2-year or 4-year cycle of huge swings for the first time ever in this nation's history. So I hope that last week, most of you had the opportunity. I was in the chamber, but if you weren't, I would ask you to go back and listen to Senator Sinema's speech. Some people would have just spiked the football on our side of the aisle saying it looks like she'll preserve the filibuster, we can move on. But what I heard was a member calling on us to bridge the gap and make progress. That's what I heard. And on voting rights, I think we can. I think the American people need to know that if this fails today, it's not the end of the discussion of progress that we need to make. My staff said, we don't want you to put this board up because we're afraid that'll tip your hand on things that you're having discussions with. I've had a number of discussions with members on the other side of the aisle. We have legitimate problems that we need to fix. We need to make it harder to cheat and easier to vote. We need to reform the Electoral Count Act that, with all due respect to the majority leader, I think that he said it's unacceptable and insufficient and even offensive because he said scorekeeping matters little if the game is rigged. If the game is rigged, that sounds like what President Trump was saying just about 18 months ago. Now we've got both sides of the aisle talking about how the game is rigged. what we're doing is creating more discontent, and we're actually suppressing people's interest in voting because they think their vote won't count. That's what's being said in this chamber today. That's what we have to stop. There are a number of things that we can do. I voted against all the objections of my 7 Democratic colleagues on January the 6th. Stand by it, proud. I was proud to certify that election. But since 2001, the Electoral Count Act has been weaponized. You had 14 House members object in 2001. You had 31 House members, a Senate member, object in 2005. You had 7 House members object in 2017. And we had 138 House members and 7 Senate members object in this last election. It's clearly become weaponized. We clearly have to make it clear that the vice president's in a ministerial position and there should be a higher bar for lodging an objection. There are other things that we could do for the certifying agencies across the states to say you can't change the rules after the election is held. That's what we should be talking about. We should be talking about making it easier to vote. I don't know why New York rejected by a 58-42 margin same-day registration last year, but they did. The voters went to the polls, and I'm reminded of you saying that the legislature overturned it. So now is the legislature in New York going to overturn 58% against same-day registration and 54% against no excuse absentee ballot? I've got no excuse absentee ballot in North Carolina. I think we should encourage more states to do the same. So where does this need to head? After the tensions cool, and after what I hope is a failed vote today to change the rules. And incidentally, the day that Republicans changed the rules for the filibuster is the day I resigned from the Senate. And I believe that I have a number of members on my side of the aisle that would never do it. So you don't have to worry about the argument. If you don't change it now, they'll just change it when they hit the trifecta. It's not going to happen. And Senator Kaine, I think I was naive. When I signed that letter saying after President Trump called for nuking the filibuster 34 times, I said, get me on a letter to preserve the filibuster. I went home and I was attacked. I've had the protesters, I've had the censure proposals at county GOPs and state GOPs, and I stand by it, and I'll stand by it as long as I'm here. But I have to say I feel a little bit disappointed and a little bit betrayed by the fact that the 32 members who signed it on the Democrat side, all but one, now say, well, things have changed. They haven't changed. And we can't let this filibuster change. We need to work on making it easier to vote. We need to work on making it harder to cheat. There are reasonable solutions that I think both sides of the aisle can agree to. And the American people need to know that there are people like me and other members that are going to fight for that after this vote hopefully goes down today. Let's not build a wall between our two chambers. Let's continue the relationships that we have. I had 5 conversations with members on the other side of the aisle this morning talking about legislation we're working on, a visit to North Carolina to spend some time together outside of the political cauldron that we're in here now, helping somebody out with a vote in judiciary for a judicial nominee that you otherwise may be incented to vote against. But let me tell you, if you want to destroy that opportunity moving forward, vote to nuke the filibuster. Vote to have any rational basis for working with members when one of us hits the trifecta. But I do hope after this vote fails today that members will answer the call to fix what's wrong with our system, fix the Electoral Count Act, make it easier to vote and harder to cheat. Thank you, Madam President.
The senator from Oregon.
Madam President and colleagues, I'm going to talk for just a few minutes about vote by mail, and I think Senator Klobuchar will probably be joining me. Now, Madam President and colleagues, I am the first United States Senator to be elected completely by mail. The second United States Senator elected completely by mail was my friend, Republican Gordon Smith, a senator well known to many here in this body. So the country looked up, and its first experience, colleagues, with vote by mail was thoroughly bipartisan. One Democrat, one Republican, who, as it happened after running against each other, got along very well and did a lot together. So as the country began to get its arms around vote by mail, it was bipartisan, and the bipartisan efforts to build on it really took off. They took off all across the country until President Donald Trump got elected and began to spew all these lies about vote by mail. So then something that was completely bipartisan suddenly became very partisan. And what I want to do is rebuild that bipartisanship. My colleagues seem to say that's what they want. And the fact is, vote by mail is the gold standard for casting an informed vote, particularly for working people, seniors, and others who would like the time, the opportunity in their living rooms and their kitchens to look at the ballot, consider the various alternatives, and in that effort now to undo the damage done by Donald Trump to vote by mail, and in the name of restoring bipartisanship, which is what it's all about. And I can just tell my colleagues, our late Secretary of State, Dennis Richardson, used to say he was about the most conservative person who ever lived. He basically told Donald Trump to go fly a kite when it came to vote by mail. Dennis Richardson, our late Secretary of State, an arch-conservative, said the reality is there hadn't been the fraud, it's worked very effectively, you're off base. So in the hope of being able to restore that bipartisanship, I just want to ask a question of the distinguished chair of the Rules Committee, and then I'll wrap up very quickly and we can move on. But we've had an awful lot of revisionist history with respect to vote by mail, and Senator Klobuchar, I know the Rules Committee under your leadership has really dug in to the history. Colleagues, Utah, bright red Utah, votes by mail. So Senator Klobuchar, take us through that history, and then
Well, thank you. Thank you, Senator Wyden. I want to thank you. We know that Oregon was the first to use vote by mail for a federal election, although I think that Senator Padilla, a great member of the Rules Committee from California, would tell you that, in fact, California and Washington first allowed any voter to request a mail-in ballot in the 1970s. But since then, what has happened? Utah, considered a red state by all accounts, has mail-in balloting for nearly all of their voters. We have seen this across the country. Today, 34 states allow any voter to request a mail-in ballot, and during the pandemic, 45 states actually allowed this to happen without an excuse. So what happened during the pandemic is that we saw 11 states that didn't typically allow all voters to request a mail-in ballot do so. Now, sadly, 10 of them have already started rolling this back for the next election. We know that this is a really safe and good way to vote, whether there is a pandemic or there isn't a pandemic. And the key is voters got used to it, they liked it, and attempts to roll this back and to make it harder to vote are the wrong way to go for our country. And instead, we should be assuring that everyone, regardless of their zip code, regardless of their state, should be able to vote by mail. Thank you for the question.
Madam President, let me just close very quickly. The fact is, we can bring about the bipartisanship that many of my Republican colleagues have been talking about over the last 4.5 hours. It is doable. It is possible to do it in a way that builds on a practical gold standard for informed voting used in Oregon, used in bright red Utah, and it's what we had until 2020 when Donald Trump tried to preempt the progress we were making, because in every rally he would talk about all this fraud, for example. Fraud, Madam President, the last analysis of fraud in Oregon is 0.00001% of all votes cast. So we can get back to what the Republicans have been talking about over the last 4.5 hours, but the way you're going to have to do it is they're going to have to go to Donald Trump and tell him, look, we just don't agree with you on this. And that's the kind of leadership that we need. We saw it in Oregon. We saw it in Utah. We've seen it now from sea to shining sea. That's what it's going to take. I want my Republican colleagues to know we will meet them more than halfway. But they're going to have to start taking on Donald Trump's lies on these issues if we're going to have that bipartisanship that my colleagues have been talking about this morning. Thank you, Madam President.
The senator from Rhode Island.
Madam President, this past weekend is our annual reminder as a country of the courage and suffering and sacrifice and passion and love and energy that so many of our fellow Americans put into protecting our democracy. When in a democracy, one group of citizens can deliberately, purposefully make it more difficult for another group of citizens to vote, they have put a dagger into that democracy. We cannot let that happen. And I'm here today to focus in particular on one voting right that we have in this country, and that voting right is, when you're voting, to know what the hell is going on around you in that election. To know who is saying what. To know who the players are around you. If we're supposed to sit here as Americans and just act like indolent consumers, passive in this democracy, that's not the way it's supposed to work. Citizenship is an office, and that office has duties. And the duties include being informed of what is going on around you. And what is stopping American citizens from knowing what is going on around them is the cascade, the torrent, the Nile River of dark money that has begun to flow into our democracy since Citizens United. It wasn't enough that the Republican members of the court let unlimited money flow. They then had to refuse to react when that unlimited dark money went underground, when it went dark, when it became anonymous. They've had chance after chance to fix it, and they've refused, and we are left with this mess. It matters that citizens know who's talking in a democracy. In my circuit, the First Circuit Court of Appeals, where Jack Reed and I have the honor occasionally to recommend nominees to the president, there's a judge who I believe is the dean of the First Circuit Court of Appeals named Bruce Elia. He's a Rhode Islander. He was a Reagan appointee. He's a Republican. He's a very distinguished judge. And he has said it is crucial that the electorate can understand who is speaking, and thus to give proper weight to different speakers and messages when deciding how to vote. That crucial right is denied to Americans wholesale because of an unprecedented dark money campaign of interference in our democracy. You see it whenever it's election season. You're watching a television show and suddenly your TV screen is occupied by an advertisement that tells you that somebody is a bum, that somebody is no good, that somebody is terrible, that smears them. And at the end it says, this advertisement was brought to you by Americans for Peace and Puppies and Prosperity, some completely imaginary group that was cooked up just to launch those advertisements. And whatever filth those advertisements contained is then disappeared with the end of that front group. It's the political equivalent of toilet paper. You flush it when you're done with the filth, and whoever is behind it keeps their hands clean. So we now have a tsunami of slime, as one writer put it, flowing through our country, and it is denying our citizens the most fundamental right they have when they vote, which is to know who the actors are and who is doing what to whom. Well, in this bill is the Disclose Act that would fix that. If you spend more than 10 grand in an election, you have to report it. And I don't care how many shell corporations and donors' trusts and phony 501c4s you line up to blockade your identity, our bill will get through it. It super drills through however many screens you put up, and the American public will at last, once again, know who's really talking to them in their elections. Dark money, Madam President, takes away voters' right to know who's talking to them and what's going on in their democracy. It is a fundamental right. And unfortunately, it doesn't end there, because the other rights that my colleagues have so eloquently talked about, to get to the ballot, to be treated fairly at the ballot, to not be harassed on the way to the ballot, to be able to get a ballot mailed to you, the Republican efforts around the country to attack those rights, to suppress votes those ways, you know how that's being done? It's being done with dark money. We know it because they've been caught. It's not a matter of debate or dispute. When these enterprises are set up to deprive what Reverend Warnock calls some people of their right to vote, and when the laws are done so that that is accomplished against particularly African American voters with what one court called surgical precision, that is not happening at random. It is happening because enormous amounts of anonymous money are flowing into groups to make it happen. And I will close with two examples. One is called Heritage Action, which is the current state of the art on this is you set up a phony 501c3 and a phony 501c4, and they're a pair, and the money to the 501c3 is deductible, and the political dirty work is done by the 501c4, and Heritage Foundation, which we've all heard about, is the 501c3, and Heritage Action is its 501c4. And Heritage Action was recorded talking to its secret donors. And the person who was making the presentation to the secret donors in May of 2021 said, "We worked quietly with the legislatures. We got the best practices to them. We helped draft the bills. We made sure activists were calling the state legislators, getting support, showing up at their public hearings, giving testimony. In some cases, we actually drafted the bills for them." Or we have a sentinel. Think about that word for a minute. A sentinel on our behalf, give them the model legislation so it has that grassroots from the bottom up type of vibe. She said, and we did this with little fanfare. Honestly, nobody even noticed. My team looked at each other and were like, it can't be that easy. Well, the Disclose Act will stop it from being that easy to have an out-of-state dark money campaign take a state legislature and get them to pass voter suppression laws without the state legislators even know who is behind it. And that's on tape. I am not making this up. The other one that's always worth looking at are our friends at the Honest Elections Project, which actually doesn't exist. What exists is something called the 85 Fund. And the 85 Fund is allowed under Virginia law, Senator Kane, to have a fictitious name and to operate as if it were operating under its fictitious name. And it has several. One is the Judicial Crisis Network, which we all know helped stock the court with right-wing judges. But another one is the Honest Elections Project. Honest Elections Project and Honest Elections Project Action are the pair that work on this. Money has poured into this effort, and the Honest Elections Project has been smack in the middle of it. In 2012, 77% of its money came through Donors Trust, which is a great identity laundering device for right-wing dark money. In 2013, 96%. In 2014, 88%. In 2015, 84%. In 2016, 82.6%. In 2017, 93%. In 2018, 88.8%. And in 2020, the year that the Honest Elections Project waged dark money voter suppression, the 85 Fund received over $45 million, identity laundered through donors' trust. And much of that money came from one single $19 million contribution. Somebody wrote a $19 million check to suppress votes. Folks, if we don't get to the bottom of this, we're going to have a real problem on our hands. And when we get to the bottom of this, the American public will be with us because they hate this stuff. You can be a Bernie bro or you can be a Tea Partier and you can disagree on everything and you agree that big dark money corruption has no place in American democracy. This is the issue where Senator McConnell's political minions, the dark money behind the voter suppression effort in all these states. This isn't happening, folks. It is being done. And we've got to pay attention to who is doing it. And when we do, we will restore that fundamental voting right of all Americans to know who is talking to them in their elections, to have ours be a democracy without masks, without subterfuge, and without dark money. I yield the floor.
Would my colleague yield just for a brief comment?
Gladly.
I just want to thank Senator Whitehouse. He has been a leader on this issue. It doesn't get enough attention. It is very much part of our bill, the Freedom to Vote Act. It is universally or virtually universally supported, and it's one of the great scourges of our politics. If we don't move forward on these bills, we're not going to be able to do this because we will not get the kind of bipartisan cooperation we need on this horrible, horrible thing that I think all 50 of us agree should be changed. So I want to thank him for his efforts, not just his speech today, but of his amazing efforts over the months and years.
Thank you, Leader. Much appreciated.
President.
The Senator from South Carolina.
Thank you, Madam President, for the opportunity to talk about something really important to all Americans, but specifically important to Americans from the Deep South who happen to look like me. As I listened to the President talk about the importance of stopping what he characterized as Jim Crow 2.0, I felt frustration and irritation rising in my souls as I keep hearing the references to Jim Crow. I ask myself how many Americans understand what Jim Crow was. I am so thankful that we are not living in those days. But just for those who don't appreciate the Jim Crow that was, it was a time when my grandfather, born in 1921, would have experienced it if he was still alive. He could tell the stories of the Jim Crow South and the Jim Crow era, an era where in order for a black person to vote, you had to pass a literacy test. Now, if you could read at that point, it would not just be a test on whether or not you could read, it would be a test on, do you know who your governor was 20 years before you were getting ready to vote? It would include the threat of being lynched, literally killed, because those in power wanted to stop black folks from realizing and fully participating in the greatest nation on earth and exercising what I believe is a fundamental responsibility and right of Americans, the right to vote. It would include beatings and the power of intimidation, the loss of your job if you dared to show up to vote. And so when I hear my president and your president, our president of these United States, just a little while ago, a week or so ago, talk about Jim Crow 2.0 and using as the poster child of this new Jim Crow South being the Georgia voting law, I rushed to read the law one more time so that I could understand what in the world is he talking about. Now, I'm here this afternoon, because I had a conversation with the South Carolina NAACP about 2 hours ago. And they encouraged me to come to the floor and make my comments as public as possible so that people understand what I have read in the Georgia law and compare it to the Jim Crow South. So what we know about the Georgia law, and I've read the law, what we know about the Georgia law is the controversy that the president spoke about and that we heard members of Congress speak about over the weekend is it is illegal to get water while waiting to vote. Now, that claim has been proven false. It is not illegal to get water while waiting in line. That is false. The only time you can't get water while waiting in line to vote, according to the Georgia law, is if there's a partisan, someone campaigning for someone, you can't bring them water. But if you are an election worker or a relative, you can, of course, bring the person water. So that was completely false. But if that is the threshold of the new Jim Crow era, it looks nothing like the past. However, even that is false. What else is in that Georgia law that is supposedly the poster child of voter suppression? It allows for early voting, to include now the souls to the polls, where you have Sundays where you can vote early. As a matter of fact, 17 days of early voting, more early voting than the president's own home state or New York. It allows for mail-in ballots without an excuse. The same thing that was turned down by the voters in New York. No excuse, on demand, mail-in ballots is now the law in Georgia. New drop boxes. That pre-pandemic, there was a box in Georgia. Now it is legal to have a drop box in Georgia. And voter ID, supported by at least 60% of African Americans, 60% of Hispanics, 60% or more of the majority population. After going through point by point and realizing in South Carolina the minority than the overall turnout in South Carolina, and 2 of the 3 African American senators in the United States Senate today, 2 of us, represent those southern states, it's hard to deny progress when 2 out of 3 come from the southern states that people say are the places where African American votes are being suppressed. Not to mention the fact that 2020 was a banner year for minority participation in the greatest nation on earth from a voting perspective, and that is, my friends, good news. The Democrats' proposal would allow for the supporters of Bernie Sanders and their tax dollars to go into my reelection account. I oppose that. It would undermine voter ID laws across our country. I oppose that. It puts unaccountable bureaucrats in charge of our elections. Americans oppose that. And walking in on the day of the election, registering to vote without any verification is something I, too, oppose. And so, Madam President, when I think about the important issue, to have a conversation in a narrative that is blatantly false is offensive, not just to me or Southern Americans, but offensive to millions of Americans who fought, bled, and died for the right to vote. So if we're going to have an honest conversation about the right to vote, let's engage in that based on the facts of the laws that are being passed surrounding those laws, where it looks like power is more important than people. I'll close with this. The Civil War of this nation started in my hometown. One of the most powerful and popular senators in the history of America was Strom Thurmond. 2010, when I ran for Congress in the place where the Civil War started. And I ran for Congress in a Republican primary against the son of Strom Thurmond. I won that race, not merely because of who I am, but because of who we have become as a nation. The evolution of the hearts of America and the hearts of Southerners could not be more clear on a day when the son of a single mother, mired in poverty, runs against the son of one of the most famous senators in the history of the country and comes out victorious. I would love for us to have a conversation about what we're doing for Americans as opposed to this negative, false narrative of what is happening to America. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President,
The senator from New Jersey.
I have deep and tremendous respect for my friend from South Carolina. I'm not a senator from the South, but my family hails from the South. From Monroe, Louisiana, to Alabama, to North Carolina, I know my roots, and I know the challenges of Jim Crow, and thank God we are not in a time of Jim Crow. The history that my friend talked to, I know this history, and I know my colleagues in the Senate know this history. We're all not blind to what happened in terms of racial oppression going back to the founding of this nation. The Constitution that people have been waving around, it's hard not to read that and not see that many of the compromises were based upon an acquiescence to that original sin of this nation, than slavery. We know the violence of what he said and talked about. I'm frustrated that we can agree that there has been overwrought language on both sides of the political aisle around this issue, but we should be focusing in on the facts. I have a hard time listening to people that want to talk about this issue and don't talk about facts. In the United States today, it is more difficult for the average African American to vote than the average white American. That is not rhetoric, that is fact. We know that black voters on average are forced to wait online twice as long as white voters. We began this session today swearing an oath to that flag, saying that this would be a nation of liberty and justice for all. Where is the justice in a nation that there is, on average for a black person, twice as long to vote? It's factual, but let's keep going, because I heard my colleague speak. During the 2016 presidential election, residents of entirely black neighborhoods waited to vote. They were 74% more likely to spend more than 30 minutes at their polling place relative to residents of entirely white neighborhoods. That's a fact. Similar racial disparities were observed right before the pandemic. In the 2018 midterm elections, a Brennan Center report found that Latino voters waited almost 46% longer than white voters, and black voters about 45%. The report also found that Latino and black voters were more likely than white voters to wait in the longest of lines on election day. You could go into state after state and you will see who waits factually on longer lines. Georgia. Are we going to reduce this to just being about water? I find that law offensive, but that's not the thing that offends me most. You want to know what's going on in Georgia right now? They have a historical pattern of dwindling polling places in the diverse areas, with some voters in Georgia waiting up to 10 hours in predominantly black neighborhoods. Think about this for a second. You want to talk about voter suppression? You're working a job, you're taking care of young kids, and you're going to give up a day's salary in Georgia to vote? You want to talk about a modern day poll tax? And my friends on the other side are saying that race is not an issue here? I'm going to continue with facts because I was flabbergasted that someone could stand up here and say there's not a different experience for blacks and whites from voting. I'm just going to continue to read the facts. Since Shelby v. Holder, that eviscerated the Voting Rights Act that people like Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner died for, black voters in Georgia have faced disproportionately longer lines and fewer polling places. The average number of voters per polling place have grown 40% in diverse Atlanta metro since 2012, and voters in black neighborhoods waited nearly 10 times as long on average after polling places were closed in neighborhoods. I'm looking for amen from my colleague from Georgia. I mean, in what country are we where a certain minority in predominantly minority communities has to wait 10 times as long? And so when you read, and I've heard my colleagues read these laws, they read, well, what's wrong with having no drop boxes because, hey, we didn't have them before the pandemic. What's wrong with not having that many days to vote by mail? What's wrong with these things is obvious because they're not designed for voter protection. They're not designed to help voters have more access to the polls. They are designed to suppress the vote and create these longer lines. That is the obvious result. And if you can't see that, I'm flabbergasted. I'm sorry, it's hard. This is not my turn to speak, and forgive me to my colleagues, but I am flabbergasted that the Republican Party, the party of the 14th Amendment, the party that once fought for equal access to the polls, is now creating this ruse that every 19 states, that the states that are passing these laws, 19 states, this is not about voter protection. Donald Trump's own person said this, the last election was the safest, most secure election in American history. This is not about in-person voter fraud. Study after study has shown that you're more likely to be struck by lightning. This is about lies. I'm sorry, this is about lies, and they're targeting groups. I'm going to go on with the facts, but I just want to talk about students for a second. I heard Senator John Tester. I've heard my colleagues from New Hampshire. And they're not hiding the ball, folks. They're not trying to tell us, oh, we're concerned about it. As early as 2011, state Republican House Speaker at the time in New Hampshire, Senators, you know William O'Brien? Can I get a hallelujah there? Promised to clamp down on unrestricted voting by students, calling them kids voting liberal, voting their feelings with no life experience. I hear what you're saying, that this is these laws are innocuous on their face. But if you start looking at the legislative record, you see groups are being targeted in this country. Polling places are diminishing on college campuses. Voter ID laws are being created so complex in Midwestern states that they're saying you can't use a 4-year ID, it's got to be a 2-year ID. That's some of the laws that are being passed. Can be a witness on that. And I hear this rhetoric where people pull out one law. Well, look at this law. This is just about shrinking the days, or this is so innocuous on its face. And I know there are people at home thinking to myself, hey, that doesn't sound like a big deal. Maybe Republicans have a point. No, let's return to the facts. I'm going to go to Texas because I heard the senator from Texas accuse this body of creating rhetoric that was divisive. You want to know what's divisive to a country that says e pluribus unum above where the presiding person is? You know what I want to know what's divisive? Is telling people in the Congresswoman's state that if you live in a predominantly minority area, we're going to remove polling places and change laws so that black folks disproportionately are waiting 5, 10, 15 times longer. Facts. The burden of long lines in polling places closures in Texas, in the post-Shelby County area, often falls disproportionately on black and Latino voters. Congresswoman, of the approximately 750 sites Texas has closed since Shelby v. Holder, 542 were in the 50 counties with the fastest growing black and Latino populations. Don't lecture me about Jim Crow. I know this is not 1965. That's what makes me so outraged. It's 2022. And they're blatantly removing more polling places from the counties where black and Latinos are overrepresented. I'm not making that up. That is a fact. I'm not going to stop because I'm tired of hearing that this does not have to do about singling out certain populations in our country, students, Native Americans, and not others. I'm not accusing anybody. Please, let's not throw around the defense where we crouch into defensive postures. I'm not accusing anybody of being racist. I'm just speaking to the facts in our country that I know motivate everybody here. 99 of my colleagues know it is wrong to create barriers for some populations and not others under the guise of a lie that there's a voter security problem. Let me continue. I'm sorry, Congresswoman, to keep talking about Texas. In the presidential primary on March 3rd, voters at the historically black Texas Southern University in Houston waited not an hour, not 2 hours, not 3, 4, 5, waited 6 hours. A poll of Texas voters conducted just in 2020 election underscored the disparity of non-white voters facing casting their ballots. I'm sorry, Senator Kaine, you were very good when you talked about that sign of 98% of people happy. I sat here stunned. I was wondering who they were polling, because they were not polling black and Latino voters in Texas when they did that. Let me give you the facts. 48% of black voters and 55% of Latino voters in Texas found it easy to vote. But that leaves a lot of folks that didn't think it was easy. White voters, actually 65% think it's easy to vote. Everybody's not happy. People who wait in 6-hour lines are not happy. I just want to give a couple more facts. Let's go to my dad's home state. North Carolina was one of the states most affected by poll closures. There were 158 fewer polling places in 40 counties with large black communities. And African American voter participation dropped. 16%. Why? Well, my friend Bennett said this. We still live in a country where the economic disparities between blacks and whites is what it was in the 1960s. And so if you're a black struggling family and your option to vote means standing in line for 10 hours compared to predominantly white counties where the wait is longer, you don't go vote. And that's not just black folks. The stories about disabled voters, with about 1 in 7 or 1 in 8 pointing out that it's hard for them to vote because of physical impediments, that's discriminatory against them. It doesn't mean people here are anti-disabled. We're not throwing those labels around. I'm just talking about the facts. And so I just want my colleagues to know that I can pull story after story of these states, the 19 that are passing these laws. If you pull them out and want to read them absent context, you're going to try to obscure the larger picture that's going on in our nation, is that we are seeing entirely Republican legislatures passing laws that are disproportionately impacting certain groups by the facts. And so I want to close with this, because I love what, on the march across the Edmund Bridge, they were stopped, beaten back. They tried to go again with King, again blocked by Alabama state troopers, but they finally got to their destination to protest voting rights. And I love what King said there. He talked about those people whose hearts were discouraged because they hadn't passed voting rights. And I know there's going to be a lot of people at the end of this day that are going to feel that kind of discouragement. But Reverend Warnock, King gave one of his best speeches that day, where he asked people, how long are we going to have to wait? Not long. Because the truth, I'm thinking about the lies we're hearing now, the big lies, the lies of in-person voting, where the truth crushed to the earth will rise again. Don't lie and say there's not a disparate voting reality for blacks and whites in this country right now. The facts speak differently. Don't lie and say that these laws are not being done in a way to make it harder for students to vote. Don't lie and say that we are a nation that should be doing more to ease access as opposed to putting up more barriers, because to go on more barriers is anti-democratic. Those lies will not live forever. I do believe still that the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends till justice. I still believe that the best of our democracy will come out if people do not give up and are not discouraged. I ask my colleagues right now to continue on the floor today, to continue to tell the truth of what's happening in your states, to continue telling the truth of what's happening in our nation. Because we will win this fight. I don't know how long it will take, but that will be determined by how dedicated we are to the principles of this democracy. We must live in a nation where everyone is equal, not in rhetoric or in slogan or in salutes, but everyone is equal in the experience they have through participating in democracy. The vote is the bedrock of our nation, is the foundation of the country, and it does have cracks that need our repair. Whether we get down on our knees in prayer or we stand tall, let's continue the work of this democracy so that freedom and justice does roll down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. Forgive me colleagues for speaking well beyond my time, and I apologize if I demonstrated too much emotion. Thank you, Mr. President, Madam President.
Madam President.
The senator from Kansas.
Thank you, Madam President. Confidence in our elections is vital to self-governance, and voting is a fundamental right. This is something that Democrats and Republicans can agree on. Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution states that, quote, times, places, and manners, unquote, of congressional elections, quote, shall be prescribed by the states. Over the last year, my Democratic colleagues have introduced and tried to pass several versions of what they call the voting rights legislation, the For the People Act and For the Freedom to Vote Act. But these wholesome titles seriously are misleading. The bills are partisan power grabs that will give the federal government unprecedented power over our elections and weaken the ability of state legislatures to administer their own election laws. Federalizing election procedure would export traditional state authority to the federal government and defer decisions on how citizens elect their congressional representatives to Congress. This is inherently less responsive and less accountable. This legislation would undermine state legislatures by sending taxpayer dollars to political candidates for the House of Representatives, weaken popular state voter ID laws, and make updating voter rolls to ensure accuracy more difficult. According to a Gallup poll, 80% of Americans support voter ID laws, yet under this legislation, states would be required to accept essentially any document that includes a person's name as a valid form of ID. If you want to dispel the notion that voter fraud occurs in our elections, this is not a good start. One-size-fits-all solutions, that approach that the Democrats are pushing, is completely unfit for Kansas and for the country. Perhaps even more alarming, and this is the point that I would make more, I hope, strongly than what I just said, more alarming than this federal election takeover is the Democrats' proposed means of passing it. President Biden and Majority Leader Schumer, realizing the limitations of their slimmest possible majority in the Senate, have advocated for weakening the legislative filibuster. The ability for the Senate to debate legislation until 60-vote threshold is met. Ironically, Democrats utilized the filibuster vote margin just last week to block sanctions on Russia's Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Making use of the same 60-vote threshold they are so determined to demonize. The filibuster protects the minority. It doesn't necessarily mean Republicans or Democrats. It may mean just somebody with an odd idea. It may mean rural, where I come from, or urban, where other members of the Senate come from. It may mean the ability for a member of the Senate to speak on behalf of his or her constituents and advocate for their views. It allows every senator to have the opportunity to garner more information, to seek out sponsors of a bill, to have conversations, and to pull people together before we decide on how to proceed on legislation. But the filibuster does more than that. It forces us. I'm sorry it's necessary to force us, but it forces us to work together. Freedoms and liberties are protected by process. In today's world, too many people want the outcome regardless of how the process works. That process is called the Constitution of the United States, and in our case, there's rules of the United States Senate that require a 60 vote for legislation to be considered and passed by the United States Senate. In the circumstances that those are eroded, those process issues, let me highlight that again. It bothers me so much that in so many circumstances, we set aside process because we want an end result. But in doing so, we erode the personal freedoms of Kansans and all Americans, and those freedoms and liberties are diminished as a result. I would tell that it's unusual for me to have as many of my colleagues on the floor as there are today while I speak, and in this case, most are Democrats. I would say that if we want to change the United States Senate, and I'm a critic of the way that we do business here, I've never enjoyed serving in the United States Senate in which it worked well. If we wanted to do something that would actually make a difference as compared to change the process by which we consider legislation, how about having committees that actually do their work? How about having hearings and markups and debate? Give me the chance, give all of my colleagues the chance to participate in this democracy developing legislation. But how many times have I voted on things that are garnered, put together, patchwork together, created by the leadership of the Senate or the leadership of the House, or working together a bill that is proposed by the White House? I want to have ownership, and even if I don't get my way, at least I had the opportunity, and it is the committee process that allows us to do that. And instead of fixing something fundamental as the Congress of the United States and having committees that work, we're going to change the process by which we can get to a bill or pass a bill and reduce the role that people who have different ideas play in that outcome. Give me ownership of legislation through a committee process. Don't take away my ability to better represent Kansans and Americans and people in the minority by changing the 60-vote rule. Americans voted for a Congress that is nearly a 50-50 split between the parties in the House and a precisely 50-50 split in the Senate. I don't think Americans voted to give one party free rein to implement an unprecedented power grab to nationalize elections and fundamentally reshape the way the Senate passes legislation. Thankfully, there's a bipartisan opposition to weakening the filibuster. A majority of senators agree it would bring about massive uncertainty for Americans who don't want to be subjected to the dramatic political swings when one election occurs and one party's in power and then the next party's in power. There's so much uncertainty in this world because there was never the consensus to build a 60-vote margin for a piece of legislation. We must have confidence in our elections. It matters. I want everyone who is legally entitled to vote to be able to vote. And I understand that voting is a fundamental right. But Kansans know best what's for Kansans, and congressional Democrats would be wise not to underestimate our resolve in making our own determinations. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Wisconsin.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you for covering the presiding chair for a little longer than usual to allow me to make a few words, make an address to the Senate. I rise because it is time for the Senate to stand on the side of protecting our very democracy and the freedom to vote. You know, this used to be a bipartisan issue, and I was proud to know the history that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed the Senate 77-19. And in 1982, when it was reauthorized, extending it, President Reagan said, I pledge that as long as I'm in a position to uphold the Constitution, no barrier will come between our citizens and the voting booth. And this bill is a vital part of fulfilling that pledge. When I served in the House of Representatives, the dean of the Wisconsin delegation, Representative Jim Sensenbrenner, a Republican, led the bipartisan effort for the Voting Rights Restoration and Amendments Act of 2006. You know, today, we can't even get a vote in the Senate on the Voting Rights Act. Why have today's Republicans walked so far from those that came before them? There's a simple answer. Too many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle refused to stand up for democracy and instead chose to stand on the side of Donald Trump and his big lie about the 2020 election being stolen from him. It wasn't. Trump lost fair and square, and President Biden won, and that's simply a fact. And to suggest otherwise is a fraud that undermines people's faith in our very elections. Enough is enough. We must act. We have the responsibility to do so. The threat posed by this big lie is all too real, and in my home state of Wisconsin, we have a stark example of it. I come from a purple swing state. We have had many, many closely decided elections in recent history. In 2000, then, Vice President Gore won the state by less than 6,000 votes, a mere 0.22% margin of victory. 4 years later, John Kerry carried the state by about 11,000 votes, a 0.38% margin. In both cases, despite these narrow margins, those elections went smoothly and were fair. Their outcomes were not disputed. George W. Bush declined to request a recount. No credible person, let alone a leader of a political party or elected official, claimed the election in Wisconsin wasn't fair, free, and properly decided by the voters. Once again, in 2016, we had a pretty close presidential election in Wisconsin, and another equally as close one in 2020. President Biden won Wisconsin by about 20,000 votes, a margin of victory of 0.63%. In 2020, Wisconsinites exercised their right to vote in record numbers. More than 75% of eligible Wisconsinites voted. Wisconsin voters broke the record for highest turnout ever measured in the state, with every one of Wisconsin's 72 counties producing an increase in turnout, benefiting both presidential candidates. Wisconsin state and local officials and citizens volunteered from both political parties, did heroic work to ensure our election was smooth, safe, and fair. They took important steps to make our election system work safely and securely for all voters while the COVID-19 pandemic raged in my home state. Wisconsinites cast their ballots for Democrats and Republicans up and down the ballot, and after Wisconsin county clerks in all 72 counties canvassed the results, Joe Biden won with a margin of over 20,000 votes. The voters of Wisconsin chose Joe Biden and Kamala Harris to receive our state's 10 certified electoral votes. But the scrutiny of those election results through the channels provided by law continued.